Welcome, Erica Fretwell. Some of you, as I was saying in the introductory session, would know the work Sensory Experiments. We've read some of it, Erica. So very grateful that you accepted this invite and very glad that you beat Donald Trump's shutdown to get here. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to you. You might want to just say a few words of introduction. There is a bio circulating, so
Okay.
over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Premesh and Kim, and also Lamise for making this wonderful event possible. And I'm really excited and honored to be here with all of you today. Um, so, the current project I'm working on is, uh, one might say, the diametric opposite of what I'll speak about, which is my first book. Um, I'm interested in excavating the scientific and medical history of general anesthetics, and identified in my favorite century, the 19th century. Um, Identified in the 19th century, and sort of tracking philosophies and theories of mindlessness that it generated. Um, not the Freudian unconscious, but what those in media studies would call the non-conscious. So, for instance, this would look like thinking about the narcoleptic blackout as sort of a glitch in the system. Narcolepsy was something that Harriet Tubman was known to have after getting hit in the head by an anvil by an overseer. So she had narcolepsy, and the sort of an animating legend. Her narcolepsy has been an animating legend for a lot of Black feminist theorizations of rest and resistance. So that's sort of like one path I'm tracking, and looking at, for instance, Claudia Rankine's poems that kind of feature moving in and out of consciousness. And I would be remiss if I said that this framework was not allied in some way with the death drive. But I want to leave it at that. I don't want to spend too much time with Freud. No offense to him. So anyway, that's sort of what I'm working on now. So tracking sort of like a different history of the senses through an aesthetics, and perhaps maybe an aesthetics has a place for us in this conversation today. But I will not actually be talking about that at the moment. So I've put together a PowerPoint to guide my discussion. I'll have to say in advance, being uh, moderately jet lagged, it's really good that I have written out what I need to say. So it benefits everyone, and the PowerPoint will help guide discussion and also provide you an opportunity to look at something other than me while I speak. So for those in the arts and humanities, the current move towards the senses might seem a really obvious move because it's about making claims in the name of the aesthetic, which we know etymologically means of or relating to sense perception. But what I want to offer for discussion today is how the lost science of the senses, which is called psychophysics, gives us a model for an alternate aesthetics that is made possible because, not despite, the sensory dimensions of racial difference where it leads us. So, because psychophysics is probably unfamiliar to many of you, as it was to me about 10 years ago, I want to begin with someone who probably is familiar to you, and that would be W.E.B. Du Bois, who famously recounted a question that a white acquaintance asked him: how does it feel to be a problem? I think in this room, we all know the answer, and his response to that question is double consciousness, which he describes as a peculiar sensation, an experience of measuring your soul by the tape of another world, a white world, European world. Because the souls of Black folk famously prophesied that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, we frequently read Du Bois looking ahead in time, right? Thinking about that, this book is prophetic in some sense. From this future-facing perspective, double consciousness appears an inauguration of a phenomenological tradition allied with global decolonialism, decolonization, right? Du Bois establishing double consciousness as a Black sensation made it possible to assess how social oppression shapes lived experience. So I come from an American studies context, so this is why most of my writers and thinkers are within bound to America in some way. But we have Zora Neale Hurston's essay in the 1928, How It Feels to Be Colored Me. And then, of course, Frantz Fanon's well-known discourse on the lived experience of Blackness. So that's just to sketch out very broadly how we can think about Du Bois as inaugurating a particular kind of racial phenomenological tradition. My research doesn't do that. It does not look ahead. Instead, I'm interested in looking backwards. The question I am not asking is what cultures and concepts did double conscious generate? Many have done that already, done it better than I ever could or will do. My question is, what made double consciousness a thinkable concept to begin with? The answer lies in the phrase, measuring your soul by the tape of another world. It's easy to gloss over when Du Bois says that because it appears like a poetic flourish, kind of almost, I think of Emily Dickinson with this stark juxtaposition of the abstract and the concrete, the soul in a measuring tape. But actually, it's far more literal than that. Measuring the soul is a reference to psychophysics, a science that was defined by its founder, Gustav Fechner, in 1860 as an exact theory of the functionally dependent relation of body and soul. So psychophysics was a science that tried to measure and quantify the soul's relationship to the material world. Metaphysical inquiries into the relationship among the body, the mind, and the senses have a very long history, of course. But in the 1850s, like the mid-19th century, in Germany, a new generation of philosopher-scientists began applying laboratory techniques that were derived from physics and physiology to evaluate the subjective dimension of sensation, right? Which we would sort of call as feeling, right? This is how you get the question, how does it feel to be a problem? And so these are the three main players, all German scientists looking very German. So they proposed that by measuring minute, this is the best I could do to try to visualize. So this is like really bad clip art from the 90s. Maybe it's like retro now. Basically, they proposed that by measuring minute sensory responses to external stimuli, so like the feeling of brightness that you get in response to light waves, right? That by measuring that, we can identify a functional relation between body, i.e. sensation, and what they would call soul or mind, we would call, or Deleuze would call affect, right? So this would provide, the idea was that this would provide empirical proof that body and mind are two sides of the same ontological coin. So to sort of almost go back to the discussion earlier about opposable thumbs, we need to think about the body and mind for psychophysics are not oppositional, they're opposable, right? It's like a recto verso side of a page leaf, right? Psychophysics in this way authorized a really novel view of the senses as both grounded in the body, but also greater than the physiology of the body. So in the 19th century, psychophysics was really influential, but because it lost out to experimental psychology, it has received very little attention. So it's understood, like if you were a psychology major, you'd probably get like a lecture on psychophysics, and it would be framed entirely as like, this was the weird thing that happened before we got our quote unquote real science today. It appears sparingly in media studies, which is how I found it. And a lot of kind of foundational media archaeology, media theorists, art historians have argued, the main argument about psychophysics from their perspective is that by mapping out the human sensory functions, psychophysics ushered in new modes of bodily discipline that ensured productive and predictable subjects. This is correct, but only partially so. It doesn't tell the whole story of psychophysics. And I just want to give out a sort of shout out here to some of these major thinkers. And in relationship to John's talk, Jonathan Stern's book, The Audible Past, is just absolutely fantastic. And of course, Techniques of the Observer is canon. To tell a fuller story of the cultural life of psychophysics, we need Du Bois, for whom the feel of being a problem is a perceptual event. Psychophysics made it possible for Du Bois to theorize racialization as a bodily sensation. And he alerts us to the emergence of a new framework for consciousness and subjectivity, along with new sort of regulatory techniques and experimental methods and aesthetic practices. Psychophysics propped up scientific taxonomies of race and gender and disability, but it also laid out a kind of proto-phenomenological schema for articulating the lived reality or lived experience of human difference. So my research tracks the cultural life of psychophysics, specifically within the postbellum, post-Civil War United States, which is a period marked not only by Jim Crow segregation, but also by what's been called the eugenic Atlantic, which is the deployment of biological inferiority to constitute race and disability as mutual projects of human exclusion. So psychophysics supplied a materialist theory for affect and emotion and feeling. This new vocabulary shifted the study of race from biological determinism to a more dynamic model of embodied consciousness, one in which feeling is material in its origins, but it's not mechanistic in its operations. So it's not a strictly input-output kind of formula. So in Array, we have a number of writers and thinkers and artists in this period who adapted and adopted psychophysical studies of the five senses to meditate on this affective relation between self and world. So trace sensations like a whiff of perfume or a sweet aftertaste carry significant social meanings. Their formal and narrative experimentation with the senses propose this mode of interiority that can be embodied without being strictly biological. So before proceeding, I just want to signal my indebtedness to a key insight from Black and post-colonial feminist theory, which is that affect is not a neutral ontological category. Attending to affect's historical specificity reveals how it grounds the racial order of Western modernity, especially the differentiation of the properly feeling white subject from minoritized subjects that are alternately characterized as hyper-emotional or insensible. Feminist science studies has also animated this conversation because it situates scientific practice as an institutional and political project. So it's thinking about science institutionally. Its place in the university as well. The history of science is a history of knowledge built on the violent exploitation of minoritized subjects. In 19th century contexts, Kyla Schuller's The Biopolitics of Feeling, Britt Russard's Fugitive Science, and Nihad Farouk's, the first part of Nihad's is called Undisciplined, Science Ethnography, so it's called Undisciplined, all demonstrate how a range of minoritarian thinkers and performers and cultural producers undertook their own scientific engagements and experiments in the name of freedom, and in the process of doing so, overturned institutionalized racist sciences. So psychophysics offers an account of the senses and how they're used to consolidate power and organize subjectivity, but it also sketches out the paths through which ideas about consciousness travel across oceans, how they fold themselves into structures of difference, and how they advance new conceptions of embodied selfhood. Now, I'd like to lay out how psychophysics helps us do two things. So this is generally what I'm wanting to present on for conversation today, but of course, we can be conceptually itinerant. the one is to think about affect as a racializing technology through this concept of perceptual sensitivity, and the other is reframing an alternative aesthetics that we might call aesthesis. So perceptual sensitivity is a psychophysical concept that helps us think about the very notion of race taking shape as a relative account of the body's sensory capacity, and conversely, how the senses operate as a biopolitical technology for ascribing differential ontological weight to bodies. So the story is that this is it looks like a medieval torture device called the aesthesiometer. And of course, I don't know, maybe not sorry to Germany, I'm always ragging on Germans, but this is something like a German would have meant. In the 1830s, E.H. Weber studied the subjective experience of touch. And he did that by blindfolding test subjects and then using what you see are two calipers to pinch the skin. And then he would draw the calipers closer and closer together until the test subject registered those two pricks of the skin as one tactile sensation. About 20 years later, in the 1850s, Fechner adopted this sort of experimental design to locate the moment that the mind, in his words, just notices a slight difference in sensory intensity, such as the dimming of, so not just tactile, but like the dimming of light. Like, what's the moment in which you just notice that the brightness has gone down just a slight bit? So he was testing what he called perceptual sensitivity, this point at which a sensory stimulus crosses the threshold of consciousness, which then allows a subject to differentiate among gradations of sensation, and that in turn produces finely differentiated feelings, hence aesthesiometer. So Fechner considered perceptual sensitivity the kind of affective substrate of aesthetic judgment. And in the 1870s, he studied what he called aesthetic sensitivity. He basically surveyed museum goers. He actually invented the questionnaire, so you can love him or hate him for that. Probably hate him. But he would survey museum goers about their sensory responses to line and color and form. And that's how he tried to arrive at this kind of universal perceptual threshold for aesthetic feeling. It's funny, it sounds funny. But so evolutionary thinkers like Francis Galton, who you likely know as the cousin of Charles Darwin and the founder of eugenics, incorporated sensitivity into their eugenicist toolkit, considering sensitivity an affective capacity that was vital to human development because it involved fine-tuning an organism's relationship to the world. So the higher your perceptual sensitivity, the more adaptable you were as a creature, and therefore more evolved. So Galton, for instance, he tested the auditory sensitivity of the English population, and in his book, Inquiries into the Human Faculty and its Development, which launched eugenics, reported that two persons may be equally able just to hear, there's that word just to hear the same faint sound, and yet they may differ as to the number of intermediate gradations of sensation. The gradations will be less numerous as the organization is of a lower order. It's also worth noting to do these tests, he had to invent something to try to test and determine their auditory sensitivity, and the technology he invented was the dog whistle, which I think is culturally and semiotically pregnant, that the dog whistle is itself now a trope, right, for racist statements that go just under the threshold of white mainstream perception, right? So it's one of those things that feels almost overdetermined, too predictable in a way. So in this way, he linked, sensitivity to biological organization, and so therefore sensory discrimination, being able to, for instance, distinguish a whisper from a hush, becomes part of Western imperialism's civilizationist prerogative, right? And so it sponsored this biopolitical ordering of racial groups according to their affective development, right, through their sensory organs. But perceptual sensitivity also generated a number of really cool sensory experiments that pressured this ordering. So one sort of example, just to give you a sense of what this actually looks like, is considering the case of the visual sense. So I know there's at least one person in the audience who might be excited about that. So in the case of visual sensitivity, there emerges through psychophysics this kind of way of seeing, this way of looking that I call not seeing, being perceptually sensitive to invisible bodies, and how within the specific historical context that is sort of allied with mediating grief during the American Civil War, but it moves well beyond that. But this case begins with a theological tract that Fechner wrote called The Little Book of Life After Death. In it, he argues that during life on Earth, spiritual energy crests into individual consciousness, and you can sort of see he's laid it out, what that looks like. It crests into individual consciousness, and then in prenatal life and what he calls life hereafter, that energy sinks below the threshold of consciousness into what he called a collective world soul. He drew on thermodynamics to make the case that consciousness is composed of energetic matter and therefore does not die. It simply changes form. And then he takes it one further and says, not only does it just change form, it changes specifically into a light wave. So the soul becomes a light wave. Fechner is saying that if non-living spirits are light waves, then when we have visions of them, of the dead, those visions are the dead, those are them. The dead physiologically, the non-living physiologically impress themselves as light waves on the minds of the living. So these subjective visions require sensitivity to the barely perceptible material of energetic bodies. So American spiritualists who believed that the living can communicate with the dead used this kind of technique. Technique is an important word to use, this technique of not seeing to prove the existence of spirit life. And it's really hard to see in that photo, but to our left of the sitting woman, there is a ghost. In 1862, so this historicist in me wants to just mark that this was a year into the Civil War, American Civil War, William Mumler invented spirit photography, which is a portrait of a person accompanied by a ghostly figure who is identified as the spirit of the dearly departed. So if your son died, you could go to Mumler and say, I want to see if I can see my son. And lo and behold, you would get to walk away with a portrait of you and the spirit of your son because your son is still present with you. So to be clear, this is a fiction. He did this through double exposure. So he used a glass plate that already had a figure kind of etched onto it, then used that dirty plate, right, to take a photo of someone. And so all you see is, the figure of someone who's sort of been exposed twice already. But nonetheless, what appears is a spectral figure. Many at the time considered spirit photography a hoax, but also many insisted that spirits can, in fact, reflect chemical rays. There were newspaper articles about this, about whether spirits can reflect chemical rays. So again, to be sure, spirit photography was a fiction, but it told a real story. By conjoining the camera lens to cosmic intent, Mumler put mourners into relation with the material properties of their own grief. Now, during and after the Civil War, spirit photography emerged as a technology that required acute visual sensitivity. You can see this in the spirit photograph of Mary Todd Lincoln with the spirits, you can barely see these guys, the spirits of her son Tad and her husband Abraham. These figures, they emerge from and recede into the background. They are hovering around the threshold of visibility. They're disappearing into their own appearance, sort of withholding themselves from the eye at the very moment that we behold them. So here the spirit photograph is a kind of example of a sensory experiment that produces the act of looking as an uncertain enterprise. The camera is a technology that does not restabilize vision, it actually dissolves vision. And then crucially, I just want to mark that this play of visibility and invisibility is also a play of power across the color line. In Mumler's spirit photographs, white people can be both living sitters and they can be non-living spirits, but people of color are always represented only as spirits. So here, visual sensitivity tethers the familial function of the photograph, mourning the dead, right, to its racial function. And so in this particular photo, Master Herod with the spirits of Africa, America, and Europe from left to right sort of literalizes the colonialist discourse of the vanishing American, kind of remaking genocide into inevitable extinction. The native figure's appearance in the middle sort of redoubles this kind of settler colonial fantasy of a population's biological disappearance. And it's also worth marking that the three ghosts they all straddle the threshold of visibility, but they are exposed to different ends, right? The spirits of Africa and America index this kind of ancestral past that certifies the sovereignty of the European spirit. The living white sitter himself indexes a racialized capacity to transcend space and time. So there's more to say, but I want to keep it moving. So in this way, perceptual sensitivity entails a relation between corporeality and interiority that privileges the white body as active in its suffering, as supremely capable of moving between material and spiritual worlds. So the spirit photograph is kind of, an experiment in disintegrative vision. On the one hand, it displaces the claims of both science and the state by affirming the animacy of loss, but it does so by keeping alive racialized hierarchies of feeling. So the second part would be to talk about aesthesis. So on the one hand, perceptual sensitivity served the interests of Western racial classification. But on the other hand, these sensory experiments materialize the most elemental definition of aesthetic education, which is learning to perceive. Visual sensitivity is a regulatory apparatus, as we've seen, but it also displaces the ethics of disinterest, which is aligned with classical vision, to install a mode of apprehension that's tethered to the erotics of visceral immediacy. The instrumentalization of the senses is also an invitation to forge alternative sensibilities, right? A kind of embodied form of aesthetics, defined by Alexander Baumgarten as the science of sensitive knowing, right? A kind of embodied form of aesthetics that is immanent to racial being. So I call this alternative sensibility aesthesis, the kind of sensory habitus of aesthetic feeling. And I use that term to collate two distinct but related psychophysical frameworks for aesthetic feeling. One is what Fechner called aesthetics from below, and that was him surveying people at museums about their responses to line and form and color, to get a kind of ground up version of truth and beauty. And then also what his colleague, Hermann von Helmholtz, called aesthetic induction. In distinct but linked ways, both determined that sensation has a material basis in the nerve structure, but that sensation only becomes meaningful, it only becomes legible or real through habit or learned experience. So in this way, sense experience is material, but again, it's not mechanistic. It is not overdetermined by biology or physiology. It's dynamic, it's open-ended, it's equal parts calculation and imagination. So both aesthetics from below and aesthetic induction name this sort of like the intellectual content that inheres in sense perception, right? Like in the act of sensing, knowing is already taking place, right? So their scientific studies become the basis for shifting aesthetics from transcendental to more materialist grounds, right? Truth and beauty are sensory responses, pleasure, displeasure, not just moral ideals. So his thesis names the potential of sensory experiments to push the disciplinary bounds of sensitivity. In the case of the spirit photograph, the senses can be marshaled into the disciplinary grid of intelligibility, but they also are not easily partitioned. And here I want to turn to another invention alongside the spirit photograph, more of an identification, the phantom limb phenomenon, which might be a good occasion to think about prostheses as well. Mitchell, so this was identified by an American physician named Silas Weir Mitchell. Mitchell drew on psychophysics to explain a phenomenon that confounded him because he was caring for tens of thousands of Civil War amputees, and they were all complaining about feeling a limb very painfully that they had, even though the limb had just been amputated, right? So he determined that and he called it the phantom limb, he named it that. He determined that the phantom limb is the feeling of a limb that arises when the body image, which is another new invention, this concept of the body image, the mind's internal map of itself so that you can move through space without bumping into walls or whatnot, right? So the mind's internal map of itself does not match the body's new physical configuration. So when you have your body image and your physical body don't line up, that generates this phantom limb phenomenon. But like the spirit photograph, the phantom limb is not false. It is real to the extent that it is materially felt. So he wrote a fictional story about a guy who becomes a quadruple amputee, and he drew on Fechner, somewhat cheekily, I might add, to suggest that the phantom limb is a real body part. It's just invisible to the human eye. The appendage, basically, he concludes, has changed material form from flesh and bone to throbbing pain. That's the new form the limb has taken. The invisible body part constitutes the physical body. It does not contradict the physical body, right? So the phantom limb joins the spirit photograph in proposing that the sense of sight is basically a ghost story, right? It's one in which our mental images of the past painfully haunt the present. Now, while this is a historically specific example I just offered, I also want to emphasize why the phantom limb is a useful crystallization of aesthesis. Here you see the mirror box, which was invented maybe 20, 30 years ago to actually help heal phantom limb pain. It's where, as you can see, the woman is missing her left arm, but it's neurologically complicated to explain, but by looking at the reflection of the hand that she does have, that actually feeds back into her mind and sort of rewires her body image. Sorry, I lost my place. So I want to emphasize why the phantom limb is a useful crystallization of aesthesis, because it is a sensation that questions Western ontologies, like what is real and what isn't, that evinces alternative approaches to feeling. Here, you could say we're talking about the sense of sight, but we're actually really talking about proprioception, which should be useful in thinking about jumping around, and that also materializes relations to otherness. The phantom limb enacts what we could think about as an aesthetics from below by expressing at the level of the perceptual threshold mutilatedness, right? So it's for these reasons, I think, that the phantom limb has become an animating trope in Black studies. Saidiya Hartman likens African cultural memory to the phantom limb because, in her words, it's a sentient recollection of connectedness experienced at the site of rupture. It's a feeling that does not mark, quote, a return to the originary plenitude, but instead takes dislocation as the condition of possibility for Black diasporic sociability. Similarly, the poet critic Nate Mackey invokes the phantom limb as a felt recovery, a felt advance beyond severance and limitation that contends with and questions conventional reality, that is a feeling for what is not there, that reaches beyond as it calls into question what is there. So to be clear, the phantom limb is a sensation experienced by amputees, regardless of their social or racial position. But from Hartman and Mackey, we glean how the phantom limb is a culturally and conceptually, or you could say heuristically, Black aesthesis. It names the dismembering and remembering of the Middle Passage. It is a non-localizable and therefore fugitive feeling, we might say. It expresses a creative reconstruction of Black diasporic life. So it's worth tracking the way that psychophysics made possible what is effectively a medical psychosomatic condition, but then in turn, right, how it has become a useful kind of framework or lens for thinking about the present. So in this way, we can think about how aesthesis generates epistemic ruptures, what we might call a redistribution of the sensible, which is, playing on Jacques Rancière's idea of the distribution of the sensible, right? And, for him, the aesthetic is inherently political because it redraws the bounds of what is sayable and what is visible and what is audible, which people can speak, which people can be heard, which people can be seen. Aesthesis aims to apprehend uncommon synesthetic sensibilities that run athwart liberal common sense. And it does that by materializing relationality as the grounds of human and non-human ontology. So this is sort of like against the Aristotelian, like Aristotle, who's the guy who invented the five senses. But so contra this kind of Aristotelian model of the senses as a means of extracting information from the world. That's fundamentally how Aristotle theorizes the sense, is how we extract information from the world. Aesthesis, we can think about aesthesis as a way to redistribute the sensible by illuminating how we neuronally or metabolically interact with our surroundings, the transitivity of subject and objecthood, representational histories of being and belonging, new ways of proliferating techniques and technics of the human in a more than human world. So just to wrap up, and here you have some fun, smaller histories, people who tried to stage perfume concerts, a color organ. You could play colors. These did not succeed, but that doesn't mean that they weren't successful in their own way. While psychophysics shows how the senses served as the substrate for considerations of modern subjectivity, more broadly, it suggests that we be continually aware and careful with and conscious of our own assessments of contemporary sense and sensation, which I think will carry through in the next few days. Renewed attention to the history of the senses might renew our own critical sensibilities as well, and it might do that in at least two ways. The first is this idea of the interval, which is a term that I borrow from political theorist William Connolly. He has just an offhand, it's one of these brilliant offhand phrases that I sort of grabbed onto. He describes what he calls the fugitive interval between a sense perception and its cultural organization. So I'd hazard the hypothesis that what happens in that fugitive interval is synesthetic. Synesthesia is a worthwhile object of study, but it can also be what queer theorist Elizabeth Freeman calls a sense method. A sense method for what we might say undisciplining social thought. So for instance, and I draw on these two examples because I talk about them in my book. So my my book has a chapter on each of the five senses, but I'm also trying to unsettle the striation of the sensorium by supplementing each chapter with a brief interval that describes experiments across the senses, such as the color organ or the staging of perfume concerts, which, by the way, the perfume concert was first put on by a Japanese American artist in 1912, Sadakichi Hartman. It didn't work out, and recently there were efforts to like revive and reproduce that perfume concert. So these intervals show how sensation was crucial, not simply to the project of enforcing political discipline, but also to challenging it. The second way it might sort of replenish or renew our own critical sensibilities is thinking about how these questions gesture towards the potential to enact what Candace Chu calls illiberal humanism. And she defines illiberal humanism as the suppressed ways of knowing and being that underscore conditions and processes of subordination. So for Chu, she's trying to think aesthetics in a post-humanist moment, wanting to reclaim the human without reclaiming man or the kind of Enlightenment classical baggage that comes with it. So how do we, for her, the question is how do we not lose the human while still thinking the human, ecologically in an anthro-decentric fashion? So for her, a liberal humanism moves us beyond the anthropocentric construction and the Western delimitation of the sensorium. Although psychophysics was humanist in its aims, it mapped out human perception. Its key concepts laid the groundwork for, I would posit, an illiberal humanism that situates structures and experiences of subordination in that cybernetic web of relations in which they are enmeshed. Right, after all, the senses shape material relations, the aesthesis, right, of which knowledge making, art making, world making practices are themselves made. So I threw up a few questions that might guide discussion, but also don't have to. But that's sort of where, in working through sort of some key concepts from psychophysics and histories, where I ended up thinking, and I sort of landed on thinking about intervals and a liberal humanism as some of the affordances that the history, the institutional and non-institutional history of the senses might lead us. So thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Very exciting.
Thank you, Erica. This was such a pleasure as a fellow nerd of science and technology studies and aesthetics and culture and technique. I am really quite excited by the point at which you ended of synesthetic insubordination, because I feel that and your historical framework was really worthwhile here, because in our forever our glance trained towards what is to come or our entrancement with the new, we forget that a lot of what we think of as new and emerging is only newly visible, that they have been there. And so my latest project, which I'm doing with my students, is on Vladimir Nabokov, maybe a writer that some of you have heard about. And he's local to my campus. He was at Cornell, he arrived. He was a lepidopterist, a practicing scientist, and he was a diagnosed synesthetic. And in his art and his science, he actually kind of practices what seems to be some of the ways forward in this last set of questions, is how can we subordinate indeed the paradigms of the limits of the paradigms of the human itself into a multi-species way of sensing and relations, webs of relations that are not, objectivized as ecology per se, from an anthropocentric ordering of the world beyond the human, but between and through. And so this is really exciting for me. And we mustn't forget, of course, that science is very technologically mediated as well, specifically the life sciences, right? From, illustrations, microscopes, photography, filmography, and so forth. And now with, actually new media art, where you have whale song databases that are then arranged into cinema uh, uh, with sense art collaborations.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just wanted to kind of express my enthusiasm about
you.
all kinds of things that your talk opened up.
Thank you so much. I'm glad it resonated, so to speak. Yeah, I think that what is useful, as you pointed out, is understanding that. I'll say this: when I came to the project, it was real. What I realized in the process of doing this research is that the rating paradigm, at least when I was a grad student and writing the book, I don't know if it really holds anymore. I think people are kind of over new materialism, but Deleuze was just all the rage, and it was this realization that what seemed to be these new theories and concepts for affect are actually old, right? And realizing that, there's a lot of histories of affect theory that typically begin with Spinoza and then work their way up. And here are a host of thinkers who tend to be glossed over, usually overshadowed by someone like William James. But this is just to affirm, right, your insight that this is that, and there's a whole host of empirical experiments behind these theories, and that in a lot of ways, I think affect theory is working through a fundamental knot. It's reproducing the psychophysical problem, which is trying to make metaphysical claims that are grounded in empirical science, which is why it's so insufficient to turn strictly to like what are they called? The like brain scans, right? Yeah, exactly, right. That these are insufficient. That you can't just pull someone. Sorry I have straw men right now. They're Germans and Brian Masumi, but you can't just pull a particular case as useful for it to back up these claims. And this is also what psychophysics was doing. It's part of why it didn't work, but also why it's so interesting, right? Because it is so conceptually and methodologically messy. And I think that it's that messiness, to go back to what we were talking before about surprise, wonder, mess, right? There's nothing messy. I mean, they're sloppy. AI is slop, right? But what happens to the messiness of human thought? That those histories are something that we shouldn't lose either, right? And psychophysics is a good example of mess.
I mean, if I could just say, my fascination with the work that you've done on psychophysics and aesthesis is how pertinent it is for thinking apartheid here. And as I've been going on and on about how this discipline arrives here in the early 1900s, and the laboratory that Wundt had built in Leipzig was the training ground of the architect of apartheid, who was invoked earlier for Wundt. He did his dissertation on what would have been roughly translated as the blunting of emotions, which worked with an apparatus called the Rauchsberg memory apparatus to test sense perception and responses. The problem that it was addressing, or the problems to which it was attentive, was framed as the poor white question and the native question, both of which were problems in the early 1900s. And there's a configuration of apartheid that emerges out of that distribution of the sensible, which is really worth thinking about. So this discipline, psychophysics, as short-lived as it is, has far-reaching consequences. And I want us to just think a little bit about, what the implications are, both of naming it as a fugitive science. So that I found fascinating in your book, because if it derives from slave practices, as you say, it's appropriation, and let's call it that, it's a broad term, to this physical science, to the kind of science of the human, and the modernization of race becomes a really messy and entangled set of questions. And I wondered, whether we ought to be thinking about a genealogy of the human and of the coevolution of the human and technology along the vector of these failed sciences that come to re-articulate, recalibrate, and represent race as a modern formation. So that what you have in the US and South Africa might not be more of the same. And all the ways we've named them as settler colonial and objects of decoloniality misses the ways in which they are actually modified in ways that have become uncanny in the way in the repetition and recurrence. So just broadly, I'm so excited about having you here to help us to think a little bit about this discipline, which I think has been completely overlooked in South Africa. It's completely ignored. And yet R.W. Wilcox, who set up this laboratory at Stellenbosch University, was probably the most important figure in redefining the politics of race in this country. So I wonder if you could just think a little bit about that notion of the fugitive nature of this science and its appropriation. And, is there something recuperable from that fugitive?
I think, a figure like Du Bois would be a good example of that recuperation. Fugitive science is an expansive and broad category, and I want to just again affirm my indebtedness to Britt Russert, because her work is looking at how enslaved African Americans were using what would today many might call pseudosciences, like other failed sciences, like mesmerism, phrenology, right? Mapping out the human, right? As if your traits your internal character can be mapped out by the bumps on your head. Use those sciences, which of course had been used against African Americans, but still use those sciences to map out and produce sort of alternative kinship frames, new modes of knowledge production that served and affirmed Black humanity in the antebellum period in the US. So I think that psychophysics, again, sort of it broadly fits into that sort of framework of a fugitive science, because it supplied the vocabulary for various iterations of apartheid, certainly Jim Crow, segregation in the United States. I just, again, want to affirm that it's not a coincidence that the person who founded eugenics also endeavored and essayed studies of perceptual sensitivity, right? And at the same time, the person who founded eugenics also gave us the first systematic study of synesthesia, which is the undoing of the senses. That's a complicated configuration. And how do we think about that fugitiveness? This is why I keep turning back to Candace True, because it's a way of thinking about a possibility of sketching out alternative genealogies, alternative institutions of knowledge and knowledge making and art making and world building that aren't necessarily redemptive, but they are recuperative, they are productive, they are generative, right? They take that, like a phantom limb, they take dislocation or subordination as the occasion for generating knowledges that have the potential to undo, right, the disciplining of the racial body and the sensory order and the racial schema that it underwrites. So it's always, and maybe this is just as a humanist, it's always a sort of both and fugitive science is still, it lives in the world of both and. It's the sort of holding out of the undisciplining, right, that is both a technology of discipline and it could also be a technique for undisciplining, but it doesn't have to be necessarily.
Shamefully, I've not read your book. Now I know why I need to read your book. But do you take up the Harney-Moten concept of fugitivity?
Yeah.
And doesn't that do something interesting here? I mean, in other words, it's a way of capturing that technology technique moment where you're trying to think about, no, there's something in this already that's
Right.
about the, to use an old vocabulary, deconstruction of the arrangement.
Right. Right.
That's one thing. I just wanted to sort of see where that goes for you, if it goes anywhere. Related is this notion of the interval.
Yeah.
I see how you're using it, but it's also pretty straightforward musicological term. And, you know, certainly one of the ways in which the relationship between non-Western musics and Western musics, especially as they arose in the wake of the Middle Passage, has a lot to do with thinking about different note values. I mean, the cliche is the blue note. It's a different way of getting at how intervals would work in a scale, in whatever mode, doesn't matter. So I just wondered if that is a relevant piece of thinking about synesthetic. You know, what, for example, what does it even mean to say a blue note?
Right.
When you mean a particular way of African Americans producing scales, saxophone, guitar, whatever it might be. As I said, many things, but just to kind of get started and cue off of the earlier question.
Yeah. My response would be to actually try to answer both questions, which maybe I'm either going to do both really well or fail on both accounts. The framework I work with Fred is his description of fugitivity. He calls it a hollow sensual field of experience, right? And he doesn't say synesthetic, he says hollow sensual. So I think that there's a general sense like the holisticness, right, of the sensual field taken as multiplicitous but not unitary. I think that is how I'm trying to think about fugitivity and, by extension, the interval as a space of rupture and production that can be, I don't know I don't have the ethnomusicological background to speak to the materiality, but I'm trying to think about the interval in the same way that Fred thinks about fugitivity, but also he talks about haptic. That's when I think about the haptic, right? Which is the way that Harney and Moten talk about the haptic, especially the haptic as this sense that is birthed in the hold of the slave ship, right? Where kidnapped Africans are contained. It's a site of contention and connection, right? It's both intimacy, but also violence, right? And so I'm thinking about fugitivity and the interval within that framework, right? Of a kind of haptic, hollow-sensual space in which that violence is inherent, and the joy produced from that stems from that, not despite it.
I'm Patricia. I'm also at CHR. Erica, that was just really wonderful to listen to you, and I especially appreciate the carefulness of your language. And, you're using... So I'm taking my question in a slightly different direction. I notice how you use the term tethered a lot, and how careful you are to be suggestive rather than expository. And I really loved your work on the spirit photography and this whole unstable enterprise. It's really wonderful. And it brought me to think about a term that did crop up very briefly in your talk, which was the index. Mm. And I'm just thinking about the empirical sciences of the 19th century and how important the notion of indexicality then later became for aesthetics and art history and so on. Yeah. And of course, the term index also applies to the hand. It's about the index finger, which is pointing, so we're back to John's digit. However we want to think about John's digit, but anyway. So I'm just wondering about, these sciences and the attempts to implement machines that can measure accurately these sensory responses, which is really fascinating. Yeah. but also that those calibrations, which are supposed to produce some kind of exactitude, feed into a whole truth-telling ideology, set of beliefs, so that these apparatuses are meant to deliver a certain kind of truth. I also like the way you talk about aesthetics from below and you place another kind of truth there. So just appreciation.
Thank you.
But I wonder if I can direct us towards thinking about going from the index to empiricism, and what is the link between empiricism and empire? So how do these things also emerge in the 19th century through empire?
Right.
And this takes me to the figure of Francis Galton, who began his career getting sponsorship from the Royal Geographical Society to make an expedition to what is now northern Namibia. It was called South Africa at the time. It was not colonized. And if you read, so then it's interesting that our colleague at Wits University, Keith Breckenridge, who's written a book about biometrics, that's his first chapter. So trying to historicize biometrics to Galton's expedition, with which I really profoundly disagree with Keith, because Galton at the time was really, his thinking was a mess. And he only learned how to use the sextant while he was on the ship going out. And he was helped by a Swedish naturalist who was also on the same ship, whose name was Charles John Anderson, who eventually went on to collect an enormous number of bird specimens, stuff them, and send them to Sweden, where they still remain. So the kind of extractive logic of these empirical things. So the two of them went on an expedition to visit they were looking for a particular river, and they completely failed to do so. And Keith Breckenridge cites Galton using his sextant to measure the physical body of a Khoi woman as an example of early biometrics. But Galton also did many other different kinds of representations, and later even criticized other traders, explorers, for their abuse of African people who he had visited. So there's this process of emergence that's might warrant some thinking about the sort of the hardness of the empiricism. And just to say also that he used Charles John Anderson later, after he returned to England, Britain, because he wasn't prepared to do any more field research. So he got Charles Anderson to do research for him. And Anderson complained bitterly about how poorly recompensed he was, etc., etc. So you have a very messy archive out of which people have jumped to very easy conclusions. And the other thing to say about Galton is that when he started doing his eugenics work, where certain social classes and categories of people inside Britain were as important as native peoples, as they became called, that eugenics itself didn't really flourish there, but were transplanted to the United States and taken up very vigorously, as Sean Michelle Smith and other scholars have talked about. So, sorry, I'm just trying to map in a bit of empire into the emergence of these empirical sciences. Thanks.
Absolutely, thank you. The so to return to your point about indexicality, I'm going to try to thread it through empire as best as possible. The index and indexicality, of course, starts with Charles Saunders Peirce in his semiotics. And the index, of course, points to a specific thing, right? The pointing finger. the interesting thing about psychophysics is that it theorized a kind of aesthesis semiotics by saying that the sensation becomes a sign. After experiencing a sense over and over again through experience, it becomes a sign so that we associate whatever you would call, note A from a violin as note A from a violin, right? But it is nonetheless, it remains open-ended. This is what a phantom limb is. It's an embodied sign, right? That means something different for everyone, though we can all agree that it is generally classified as this painful feeling. We all know that, unless you're colorblind, you know green is not pink, but we all see green a little differently, et cetera, et cetera. So it kind of is an undoing of that index. There's an index that points, it's like a moving index at all times. It doesn't point to a specific truth. But we can all understand it points to like a specific area, right? But it doesn't pinpoint. And so it's like I use, William James's idea of radical empiricism, right? Which is a softer empiricism, right? So this idea that the sensations they reproduce not in the sense of the copy, but they generate more feeling. Feeling generates more feeling. And I'm also, I think, Latour works in this tradition as well. What has been foundational for my own thinking is one of his early sort of sociological accounts of perfumers going to school, and they're given these odor kits, and they have to learn how to identify these distinct odors. And he says that over the course of these weeks, the word violet carries with it these meanings that it had not before. And so within that framework, I'm sort of taking this sort of what appeared to be the hard empiricism of psychophysics, and actually reattaching it to what was most transcendental idealist thing about it, which was this metaphysical, this attempt to answer the mind-body problem, right? So people want to say that reduce psychophysics to like a really bad, hard science, like boy was it wrong. But understood within the context of its philosophical preoccupations, we actually get a really interesting account of language and aesthetics, right? And of sensation as kind of, again, it sounds redundant, but sensation as inherently aesthetic in the sense of a kind of material but open-ended process, an ongoing dynamic process. And in that sense, it might return us to the fugitivity of psychophysics in its capacity, one, the hard part of psychophysics, the sort of measuring part, of course, was adopted and adapted and used for the purposes of empire building, right? But the radical empiricism component of psychophysics works against the extractive logics and practices of empire. I'm thinking about, thermodynamics and energopolitics, right? And the way that aesthesis inherently pushes back against that kind of extractive logic, the reduction of all energy to a kind of machinic output in service of global sort of white supremacist and imperial demands, right? That's where your thinking leads me, but we can certainly talk more about that.
I wonder if it might help to kind of introduce a little distinction, because I think there's, and it's related to the figure of the slave and how we stitch the figure of the slave back into the 19th and 20th century, which I suspect is at work in Moten and a whole number of others. You cited Saadia Hartman. And I've been thinking a little bit about what one does with that figure of the slave as it's stitched back into history. At one level, you get the history of empire.
Right.
You get a colonial discourse, and you get a transformation of the figure of labor invested in the slave into new models of labor, and so on and so forth. What is lost, I think, and what psychophysics seems to return us to, is the speculative dimensions attached to the figure of the slave. And if you trace it through the speculative, which is since Marx was spoken about earlier in the Grundrisse, that essay, which gets dropped in his study of capital, he's interested in something like speculation. In fact, speculation barely appears in the 3 volumes of Capital. And yet, when you think about the late 20th century, and I'm thinking about Ian Bocom's Spectres of the Atlantic, the slave returns, because of finance capital, as the figure of speculation. So there's something about holding both of those in play, but that the fugitive might not be sufficient. So what Saadia Hartman and all, hats off to them, wonderful work and so on, but there's something that's lost in the recuperation or recapitulation of the figure of the slave. And that is the speculative dynamic that I think psychophysics kind of lifts out for us in the image.
Yeah, and I believe, I refer to psychophysics as a speculative science, which on its face sounds like an oxymoron, but in fact is simply a paradox. Because it weds these kind of open-ended, it takes sort of what would be hard data and actually explodes it in the attempt for it to serve these larger philosophical questions. And I'm thinking too as well of a fantastic book that David Kazanjian wrote called The Brink of Freedom, where he looks at the year 1848, which is a year many know, or I'm sorry, 1847, because it's the year before. That's what, his whole point is, like, I'm looking at the year before everything happened. But in Liberia and then the Yucatan. And in Liberia, he's going through the archive and reading letters that formerly enslaved African Americans wrote. So they went to Liberia, moved to Liberia, and then wrote letters back to their former enslavers. And he's talking about these letters, this epistolary archive, as a kind of speculative act. That these historical materials aren't just purely evidentiary. They're not just hard evidence of something, right? That actually these letters are meditations on what freedom means. And so in that sense, I'm not sure. I think it's an open-ended question and maybe something worth discussing in the next few days, the relationship between fugitivity and speculation and speculativeness. I don't know that there is an easy and clean break, but I think it is worth trying to be more precise in which terms we're using and how we're engaging them. Because in some sense, we might say that psychophysics can be taken up or used towards fugitive ends, but it's ultimately speculative in its operations. And I think in that sense can help us think about the figure of the slave in this broader kind of world-making project and how it emerges out of, to go back to Fred, right? It emerges out of these kind of abject conditions, right?
My question is around your use of interval, and particularly thinking of interval as a site of rest, where one can recognize those sensory perceptions that you are experiencing, and then in turn can almost reckon and like resist particular systems and that you are facing. But also, could we not see the interval as a liminal condition, particularly in that it's not just a break from an activity, but rather it's that process and that transitional phase in which we move from one state to the next. When you think of like the law of thermodynamics, energy cannot be created or destroyed, but moved. When is that movement occurring? Is it in that interval?
Right. That's a great question. I think it's very useful, like you're saying, to think about the interval as not as rest so much as an alternative or alternate kind of process, right? It's a slowing down. I was thinking about your insistence, John, about slowing down, right? So the interval is that kind of slowing down. Lauren Berlant would call it an impasse. So what's the difference between, another question might be, is an interval an impasse? Are they both the same? I'm not totally sure, but right, these moments of kind of suspended or slowed down time where particular sort of grids of intelligibility are held in abeyance, right? And I love the fact that you said reckon, but not necessarily resist, right? Because I'm wary also of making broad claims about X, Y, or Z being resistance, right? And that being a necessarily, yeah. So, but I think reckoning is a great way to think about that. It is a space and time of reckoning, right? So I'm just elaborating on your your great thought.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the concerts, the older concerts, because it's interesting to me how the scientism of the then emergent field of musicology was being resisted by people who were in the music. Because prior to that, of course, with the tuning of the world, the invention of that thing, 440 hertz, etc., there was Jean-Philippe Rameau's alignment of particular scales with humors, etc. That's just by the by. The other thing I was thinking about that you could help with, because I don't really know, but I thought it might be interesting, was to what degree might what you're saying about perceptual sensitivity and its potentials help us rethink Fanon's notion of the condition of the native as a nervous condition. Because what you say about sensitivities and how it's not just the complex way that you talk about it just made me think of that. I didn't, yeah. But what I can speak to way more coherently than I am thus far is how middlebrow this strikes me to be. There was a slide you had earlier there where the writer was saying, I've tried to submit my article and my studies to every medical journal. It's been rejected by all these medical journals. So there's something quite middlebrow, and that comes to one when one is watching Agatha Christie telenovela modifications, where there will be somebody talking about the spirit world, and Miss Marple or Poirot will be like, no, there's a rational reason. So there's always the opposing thumb to whatever it is that psycho whatever is pointing to, and how that links us to how we were taught in the colonies. How it wasn't the Arnoldian, the best that has been taught in the world. There was a mixture of the instrumentalizing of that knowledge. So instead of being taught Beethoven, we would be taught the Victorian hymn sheet. So again, the translation of that from supposed high culture to the middle brow to introduce the native to the sensitive, the sensible, the civilizational, but in a way that won't overwhelm them. So the translation, that aesthetic education you were talking about, the learning to perceive, obviously, as you said, was not, you're not just going to be able to perceive everything. There are limits to your knowledge, Horatio, or whatever. So to me, that was a major thing in terms of aesthetic education, still kept something open for the psycho. What is this thing that you're talking about? Psychophysics, yeah. For the psychophysics that was then undermined as being native retentions, yeah? Such that the West is then constructed as only rational, as only this, and you can never catch up. And that, for me, was very, very clear in the arts. So the arts, because they don't subscribe to this evolutionary teleological thing, more than other things that I don't know about, then particular vocabularies had to be constructed to pretend as if Beethoven's Sixth Symphony was not called the pastoral, that there weren't still retentions of the psychophysics or of the non-rational in Western art music at its height in the 19th century. So that for me was the middle brownness of it, and how it was put on as the height of the Western for the natives in the colony.
Thank you for that. That's an excellent point. I think that I'm thinking that one term that might be helpful is secularism, in that it is a way of distinguishing good religion from bad belief, and how psychophysics treads in the bad belief that selectively gets repurposed as the good religion, right? When it comes to the ordering of the subjects of empire according to non-rational and rational, right? Because secularism is simply just this sort of like biopolitical distinction between what is considered good religion and what's considered bad belief, and we call bad belief a cult, right? And that's why he couldn't get his article published in a scientific journal, right? But to the and the point about aesthetic education too, a great example is actually the history of the Montessori method, which I think I touched upon this in the book, but she used the esthesiometer in the classroom to teach children tactile sensitivity. And so that was an explicit training of the senses, training of sensitivity, with the idea that first they would learn to distinguish these sensations, and then they would learn literacy by touching letters that were that would be on differently textured papers. And there were also different kinds of activities like pinpricking as well. But she directly, and she says in her book that psychophysics is going to turn something like the crumbling stones of the school into the pillars of the new classroom. She got like the new pedagogy, right? Because everything's new at this point in history. There's the new psychology, there's a new pedagogy, where she explicitly brings in psychophysics as a means of reform, and that is aesthetic education. And it's also worth pointing out that Montessori, that particular method of tactile sensitivity training, was meant for the children of Rome's working poor. So basically, like the banks that owned the various buildings or the tenements there were tired of the parents going off to work and the children like graffitiing or whatever, like making a mess of the building while their parents were gone. And so they went to Montessori and she said, all right, give them to me. I got an experiment I want to do. I want to see if I can develop this new educational program that starts with the training of the senses. And so that's how the Montessori program began. But I think it tells a larger story about what is aesthetic education for some is training or manual labor for others. Like who gets to be the recipient of aesthetic education, and for whom is tactile sensitivity being geared towards industrial labor, and for whom is tactile sensitivity in service of a more refined palate for those who are deemed rational, right? So that's the broader story, yeah.
I just, your last point, I wanted to put some attention back to the material, right, of the tactile, and of which there are many examples. And it's really beautiful that we came back to the Montessori method of learning through the bodily senses as calibrated differently for the children who were being trained to be the working poor as opposed to more refined. That was beautiful point. I wanted to put a material thing into the blue note, actually, and that happens to be indigo. Indigo, the color, the plant, right? And that was one of the earliest plantation crops in the U.S. South, and is now being a subject of cultural recuperation, revival, and channeling into art forms of various kinds that your space reminds me of. I've been to the various art spaces that have reclaimed indigo. So the blue note somewhere is also the pollution in the rivers.
Wanted to come back to purse. What you've emphasized here is the distinction between the index, the icon, and the symbol, to use one of his vocabularies. But what you haven't emphasized, and so I'm sort of inviting you to do it if you want to do it, is the structure of the sign. So the object, sign, representamen. And I'm stressing that because when you burrow down into what he's trying to do there, he is trying to introduce in the notion of the interpretant's work on whether it's the object or the sign, this, he has to develop a word for it. He calls it abduction. To not be induction or deduction, but abduction, which is this feeling, it's almost like a curiosity. So the interpretant has this curiosity about what the sign, whether icon, index, symbol, what is it doing? And it just struck me that feels like it fits right into what you're doing here about trying to get at some way to register, compute, calculate even, how the sign works. and not, not so much the distinctions among them, but the structural feature. And the other thing that seems really important about him is that he was writing during the Civil War. I mean, he knows who Matthew Brady is. He's very into what's going on at the national level that philosophy has to, in some sense, process and respond to. So it's really not a question. It's just sort of you've opened up a really interesting folder there, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we can, sort of what I've been presenting could be read as an alternate account of Manan's The Metaphysical Club, right? To the extent that Helmholtz, Fechner, this idea of aesthetics from below, it's pragmatist, or it lays the groundwork for pragmatism, semiotically, but also just in that kind of radical empiricist ethos of a fact is true when it works, right? Or something is a fact, right, when it works in the real world. And so I'm just pulling, and thinking about the structure of the sign as it operates in our lived experience. And I think that the phrase, and that's why I call, this is a slight kind of jumping around in our lab, but why I call psychophysics, I could call it pragmatist, but really I feel like its heart is in this kind of proto-phenomenological vein where I don't want to really get into Husserl, and we don't need to get into Merleau-Ponty, but there's certainly a place to think about the fold and the flesh, right? But this furnishes an array of thinkers and writers, and I think us today still with a way to think about lived experience as reality, which feels perhaps like axiomatic at this point or an obvious thing, but I think it's helpful for us to inhabit a moment when it was not obvious at all, and when it actually was a jump, it was a leap, right? To think about racialization, for instance, not as a sociological fact or a biological fact, but as a phenomenological fact, right? A reality. And so I think that's where the potential for aesthesis lies, for our own critical sensibilities, in ways that hold on to and register racialization, whether it's the figure of the slave or the figure of the native, as elemental to consciousness, to how we think about and construct consciousness, not an ancillary supplemental facet of the worlds we make, but completely central to it. And that might be why, Harney and Moten are so in me that I forget to even name it, because I'm always operating from their position. Yeah.
Erica, thank you very, very much. That was
Thank you.
superb.
Thank you.